Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Tamara Rosevan and you're watching Head to Head on uatv. An anti-corruption court should be created as soon as possible and it should be completely independent. This is very important for the country. This will open up high potential for Ukraine. These are the words of Federica Mogherini, the EU's foreign policy chief, during her meeting with Ukrainian Prime Minister Volodymyr Groysman on Monday. At the same time, Ukraine has one of the strictest policies in the world for public servants and officials to declare their property and incomes. What does the anti-corruption fight mean for Ukrainian development, and what is the role of civil society and NGOs? To discuss this, we are joined in the studio by Halyna Yanchenko, head of the Anti-corruption Headquarters NGO and experienced civil activist. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hello.
So, just to get a closer understanding, a better understanding, what would you say is the role of any NGO in its fight to root out corruption and help the country in its development process?
I would say that the most important role in fighting corruption should be borne by the state bodies. But the role of NGO is important to actually be a watchdog of this of the state bodies. And if we are talking about Ukraine, this is especially important given that the recent anti-corruption reforms that have been taken after Maidan were, they were implemented because of the civil society pressure and and thanks to the actual efforts that NGO did. That is why I would say that the efforts of the NGO are important to keep up on a right track with these reforms. Also, another thing that NGO can help with is different modern tools and approaches, because we understand that the civil servants, they are sort of more conservative, they are tied with some rules and regulations, and not often they can actually implement the modern tools or new approaches to their work or to the way they communicate or interact with society. And in this regard, civil society representatives can help. And that's actually what our organization is doing a lot.
Right, and your organization isn't the only one. There's so many, I find, in Ukraine,
yes,
different NGOs and civil society organizations that are specifically targeting rooting out graft and corruption. But if you have so many people working in for different NGOs, I mean, there's one target, but it seems that different companies are working for different things. And what would you recommend that to kind of provide one single kind of a mutual effort which will help root out corruption? What would be some of your recommendations on how to achieve that?
Well, indeed, there are a lot of anti-corruption organizations in Ukraine. Furthermore, a lot of them were launched after Maidan and because of Maidan, because actually Maidan that started as a protest against ex-president's choice to be more pro-Russian and to actually not sign the agreement with European Union. So Maidan started as this kind of protest, but ended up as a protest against corruption when President Yanukovych ran away, and the whole society saw what kind of house he lived in, the efforts that he possessed. And after Maidan, anti-corruption have become actually a sense of living for a lot of Ukrainians. And that is why a lot of the organizations were established after 2014. Another thing is cooperation between this organization. But in my opinion, the cooperation is quite good. And the big role to actually facilitate this cooperation was played by reanimation package of reform, There is anti-corruption group as well as some other groups in reanimation package of reform, and my organization is also a member of this anti-corruption group. So we do communicate, we do cooperate a lot, and I believe that the more people, the more organizations are directing their efforts to actually overcome some negative issues, the better result we might have.
Right, but so speaking on behalf of your organization, what would you say are some of the biggest achievements that you've had because of, as you said, Euromaidan was essentially at the end it was about rooting out corruption because people saw the opulent and lavish lifestyle of former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, and people were outraged. They were absolutely furious. So all of these different organizations were started, but how successful have they been?
Well, I believe they, most of these organizations were quite successful because actually we know that the new parliament that was elected in 2014, they have already came when a lot of anti-corruption laws were passed. And there were some efforts to actually roll back the anti-corruption reforms, and because of the civil society, these reforms are still on track, more or less. If we are talking about my organization and our role, we have quite a unique mission. We try to actually keep with the dynamics that we had during the Maidan, as a lot of Ukrainians were willing to fight corruption, but we understand that in some cases they just don't know how to do it or what can be their input in this process. So our organization is creating tools and instruments that can help any Ukrainians, regardless to his or her education or age or any other background, to join the anti-corruption movements.
Right. So what's the main tool that you provide an ordinary citizen, an ordinary person living anywhere in Ukraine, that they can do in order to root out corruption in their daily life? What's the #1 tool that you recommend?
We have different tools for different target audience. For example, for ordinary citizens, we have created the anti-corruption repair map. So we found out that millions of hryvnias are allocated annually in pretty much every city of Ukraine for different kinds of little repair work, like residential houses or playgrounds or roads. And so we make this information visible, and we visualize it in a map. So now if you want to actually start monitoring where the budget allocation goes, you don't have to file legal documents or do some other sophisticated things. The only thing that you have to do is just to open the Google map on a special link and see what kind of allocations were around your house or around your place of residence.
Right. So
another tool that
sorry, just to interrupt you there. So just to kind of understand more. So if you look at a map, for example, and for example, we have a citizen living in a small town in Western Ukraine, and say they look at a map, they know there's a road somewhere in the center of their town, and it's got a lot of potholes in it, and they're not very happy with the general infrastructure of roads. And I think this is one of the key problems that Ukraine is currently trying to overcome. So, and they see that a lot of money has been allocated, but the potholes are still there. They're very much visible. So how does one ordinary citizen, how do they go about changing and attracting attention, or what do they do if they see that changes haven't been made but money has been allocated?
Yeah, well, we had this kind of cases. They simply leave their comment for this subject or write to Anti-corruption Headquarters, and then our legal advisors jump in the case and they help to actually check the documents, check what some have been spent, what kind of works should be done, and so kind of these kind of things. And actually, thanks to the anti-corruption repair maps, we have recently returned about 500,000 hryvnias in Kyiv on the
just in Kiev.
Yes, just in Kyiv, on 2 residential buildings that had to be isolated, but they were not, despite the allocations and despite the fact that money were spent. So again, the procedure is quite simple. 2 persons just watched at the map. They saw their residential building. They saw that the works have there should be some works for their houses, but nothing was done. So they wrote to our legal advisors, and the legal advisors have helped these citizens.
Right.
So this is the tool for citizens, but we also have some other tools for other target groups. For example, we don't only blame and shame the civil servants, but we also help those who actually want to do something good. And one of our recent tools is called chatbot Civil Servant Taras. And this tool is helping people to fill in their e-declarations easier and without mistakes. So talking about another anti-corruption reforms that have recently been launched in Ukraine, the e-declaration.
Right, and the e-declaration we're seeing as such a landmark occasion, because this was the first time in decades or in Ukraine's independence where ordinary people could see how much money their the people in power were actually making. And the response, obviously, you speak to a lot of people, and you get a kind of sense of how effective these types of reforms are. What would you say should be some of the kind of future goals for any NGO working in anti-corruption and trying to fight corruption? What do you look to do in the future? In order to have the same kind of progress that you guys have been making over the past few years?
Well, my advice for my colleagues would be not only blame the state bodies and civil servants, but also try to help those who actually want this help. And that's what our organization is also trying to do. So basically, we saw this new reform on e-declaration. Indeed, on one hand, this is fantastic reform because the Ukrainian civil servants have to file in e-declaration that is that has a lot of actually articles, and the e-declaration, the form is long and it is complicated. So on one hand, it is good because we see a lot of information about the civil servants, and we can track and we can monitor the changes in their assets and welfare. But on another hand, we saw that the state and, for instance, the National Agency for Prevention Corruption, which is in charge of this reform, was not well prepared to actually implement the reform. And a lot of civil servants, they need some consultations to fill in e-declaration properly.
And so that's where this robot comes in.
Yes.
It's a great innovation, and I think it's a really good tool. Thank you so much for coming today. It was a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
That was Halyna Yanchenko, civil activist and head of the Anti-corruption Headquarters NGO. You're watching UATV.